It's really critical to remember as we talk about all of this that actually we've always known that movement is more than goal-directed action. But I think it's something that we need to be reminded of and to bring back to conscious attention in our evaluation and therapeutic processes. Movement is not entirely goal-directed. It is not all intentional. And if behavior is predominantly motor output, then that begs the question, is all behavior communication? All behavior might be information, it might be data, but it's not necessarily all communication, especially if one of the implications of this is that all speech is not communication, because that motor output of speech can sometimes be a result of the brain-body disconnect and this disinhibition piece and these motor fragments. So let's talk about motor and movement and what it really is, and that big picture piece. You know, we've got movement outputs that we are familiar with. They're products subject to physical forces and our state of regulation, how much sleep we had, influenced by social context, influenced by the affordances we see in the environment, and that incorporate data from that library of previously sensed movement, which is not just stored in the brain, but all the way through the body. There's this predictive analytical process, these calculations that are going on all the time, even when we believe we're still. There's vestibular data from that organ inside the head where gravity is being sensed continuously all the time. And some movements are cortical, as in they are volitional, intentional, or learnt automatic movements like driving a car, and some are subcortical, which means they are not intentional and they are below the control of the upstairs brain, if you like. They're impulsive, they're reflective. So this movement outputs as a continuous, layered, and dynamic stream of motion and rhythm, which also produces inputs, as we just talked about with reafference. So we have this constant cyclical process where our own movements are sensed and serve as input. Now, Torres et al. And her wonderful team and other people too are finding this excess reafferent noise in autism, which means the quality of the sensory input is questionable and may not be helpful at all. Now, bearing in mind what I just said, that all of these what we call motor engrams, this database of previously sensed movement is not just stored in the brain, but it's anatomically distributed. It's actually experienced at that body-based level. That's what embodiment really is. What happens when this sensory input is confusing and therefore makes it very hard to predict your own movements? What if my own bodily movements were not predictable? I wouldn't learn based on error correction. And Torres's first pieces of work that really looked at this was MRI information, and then there's a lot of reach, point, and touch. And as you retract from the purposeful movement, measuring that movement on the retraction, which is less cortical based. And during the retraction in autism, what Torres's group has found is that there's elevated noise and randomness, which of course is going to impede the creation of predictive code. How can I predict if that reafference loop, that cycle, is giving me disorganizing data, if there's static in the line, if it's like listening to 3 Zoom calls at once?
So all of this sensory data that is part of the big picture. It's not about goal direction action, just about goal-directed action. There's exteroceptive data from the external world and those senses that tell us about that. There's our interoceptive data from that multi-system process of visceral data, tactile data, cardiac sensory signals, and so on, and the sensations generated through our own active movements. And so in order to have an accurate, or as accurate as we need, picture of what's going on, perception of the world and our place in space and time, there is also this ongoing calculation with all these other processes that are occurring that is sort of a subtraction of self. And so what that means is really being able to identify the salient data, in other words, the important data, and filter out the erroneous or the irrelevant data, if you like. So we're sort of there's subtractions going on as well in this process of being able to predict and generate motor outputs. So let's talk about these 4 types of motor response. This is a phylogenetic hierarchy, which means it's sort of following that evolutionary path that Torres has created. It's her work, where the system is evolving from reflexive, autonomic and reflexive to this sort of these voluntary outputs. And yet all of these types of motor response exist within each human. And so we've got autonomic, the smooth muscles, those, and we'll talk about that in a second. We've got reflexive, which is below the level of intention and thought, and it bypasses the brain, really. Involuntary, which we'll talk about in a minute, but involuntary might include hiccups as well as other things. Spontaneous, which is just below the surface of awareness. So like grimacing, gesturing. I think of it as like when I'm trying to knit, I'm terrible at it, but my grandma's great at it. And when she's knitting, she like moves her mouth with the rhythm of the knitting. And I've realized I do the same. So this is a spontaneous, non-intentional motor output, and, could be motor overflow, but also I can pay attention to it and I can suppress it cortically. So I have some volition there, but it's initiated below the surface of awareness. And that's how I think of those spontaneous motor responses. And they're very important in reflecting those inner states of emotion. And then you've got automatic, so something we learned once and that is very hard to unlearn, which is critical when we're thinking about synthesizing these 2 frames. We're often asking parents to unlearn, aren't we? Like, as parents, we sort of all automatically go, good job, and gentle, and at Star, we're saying, let's unlearn that and learn some different ways. And it's really, really hard. Unlearning is really hard. Those automatic embedded neural loops, they're like highways, well myelinated, and we're going to try and replace that with something else. Very, very challenging. And then you've got voluntary, and of course these 2 kind of pivot, where you're creating a novel, new, voluntary, intentional motor action in response to the world around you.